and the curator and organizer for tonight's event. The evening tonight aims to extend our perceptions of race and access to counter narratives that are often omitted in favour of a binary, dominant discourse that is reductionist and oversimplistic in its representation. It is perhaps impossible to introduce an event of this nature without providing some context into how a focus on the performance of race, which on the surface can come across as rhetorical, abstract, and intellectualized, how that plays out in lived experience and felt every day on unconscious and subconscious levels. White, black, brown, we unknowingly and knowingly participate or choose to actively challenge colonial legacies that live on in the socialization of race. So my journey into academia and subsequently this event is motivated by my own diasporic journey of negotiating a British identity against the landscape of melanin and empire. This is me aged 5. Even then I had the world on my shoulders, I think. Don't look very happy, do I? I did have a happy childhood. Mum. The image is significant as it demarcates a period when I first became racially conscious through the unconscious bias of a friend. We were planning out some imaginary play. My friend, let's call her Rachel, was always the princess. This time I wanted to be the princess. When I asked her if I could, she aggressively refuted the idea, informing me that I was the colour of mud and that princesses didn't look like me. Devastated, I insisted and fought back, while slowly realising that I was different. Brightening up, Rachel had an idea. I know, she said, you can be Mowgli. I don't want to be Mowgli. I cried. Why not, she responded. He's a hero. But he's not a princess, I said through silent tears. And I don't want to play Jungle Book. Flash forward some years, and we are in Thatcher's Britain. A working class person of colour is a scapegoat for all white working class problems. A narrative played out then, and a narrative played out now. The term Paki becomes a familiar word, compounding that initial difference felt aged 5. I wish that I could say in 2018 things are different, but sadly they're not. History seems to be repeating itself. And as in the 80s, neoliberal ideologies appear to domineer, and on a personal level, I still hear that word used against me. Perhaps not as often as in Thatcher's Britain, but enough to be reminded by some that I do not belong. But not all racism is vocalized, in such crass and obvious ways. Sometimes it is inherent in our systems, in our structures, beliefs, values, and social ideologies. It can even be argued that more often than not, we do not even realize how much of these damaging, cancerous attitudes have affected and continue to affect our society. My initial experiences of racism prompted me to delve into my past so that I could locate an identity that was accepting of me. That didn't other me based on the pigment of my skin, or because of my country of origin. As I delved deeper into my past, I became increasingly and uncomfortably aware of the deeply seated connections between me and Britain. that could never allow me to disengage in favour of another less othering identity. I hoped to find ancestral narratives of resistance to colonisation, to align myself with this, with an integrity, with a self-dignity. What I found shocked me. It shocked me to the core, and it catapulted me into a deeper crisis of negotiating self-identity. My journey into my past brought me to this man, whose images can be found at the National Portrait Gallery. Major General Sir Malik Mohammed Umar Khan, a soldier of the Indian Empire, one of the largest landowners in the Punjab and an elected member of the Council of State of India, a member of the Governor-General of India's Imperial Council from 1910 to 1944, and a man who was an honorary extra aide-de-camp to George V, Edward VIII, and George VI, and my great-great-uncle. And then to this man, his son, my great-uncle. Sir Malik Kizahiyat, who served on the Unionist Premier of Punjab between 1942 and 1947, just before the partition of India and Pakistan. The picture to the top right shows him with the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now, Sir Tiwana did not support independence, so those resistance narratives I was looking for were clearly not in this narrative. He was very pro-Britain, very pro-British rule. He very much saw himself within that positioning. And he was also against pro-independence, post-independence, he was against the partition of India and Pakistan. These views affected his political career once Pakistan was established as a country in 1947, and he found it very difficult to enter politics to the same calibre that he had whilst India was one under British rule. This is my grandfather, Safdar Haider Shah. He was a captain in the British Army and he fought in Burma during the Second World War. These stories are a few of many that form a period of empire that stretched across centuries and shaped the world as we know it. Stories that brought me to relatives in India, Pakistan, Kenya, and beyond. But these long list of ancestors whose identities I was seeking to help make my own identity, their identities were intrinsically linked to Britain and Britishness. I did not find stories of natives authentically attuned to their cultural origins, resisting the colonizer and sacrificing life and limb for independence. No, instead I found the compliantly colonized, aiming to please, taking pride in their Britishness. My country had lied to me, and it had betrayed me by erasing the brown and black, and by erasing empire and the imperial subject as if it all had never happened. And where were these erasures? Were they in the curriculum? Yes. In our history? Yes. In our national consciousness? Yes. The omissions were everywhere. So where did I sit? As someone born in this country from an ancestry of British subjects, where did I sit? Well, I sat in a little box entitled Paki. Nothing more, nothing less. I could locate those like me overpopulating pupil referral units, prisons, mental health systems, constantly defined by melanin and trapped in cycles of judgment, bias, and oppression. British nationalism is not inclusive. In 1966, Enoch Powell made a speech, now entitled Rivers of Blood, which forewarned the nation against multiculturalism. My father and many like him that had come to this country in the 1960s on British passports or British papers and as British subjects experienced the backlash from the rhetoric like that presented by Powell at the time. In 2018, Britons of colour like me face a subtler but still painful backlash from similar rhetoric presented by some mainstream politicians of today. But I ask, in the context of empire, wasn't Britain always multicultural? How can the imperial chapter continue to be ignored when we're discussing race? Why is Britishness now exclusive to the point whereby the colour of one's skin defines their rights to their nation? It is this diasporic journey that brought me to take back with pride what had been taken away from me, and to say that my forefathers, alongside many other black and brown forefathers, gave blood, sweat, and tears to the freedoms that we enjoy today. That my identity exceeds the pigment of my skin. Sorry, I raced through that. That I take my identity on my terms, and I make it on my terms. And I exercise my rights to citizenship, to criticise my country if it is letting me down, by creating systemic and structural barriers that prevent me from my rights as a British national. To stand on equal footing with fellow nationals, irrespective of difference, and exercise my rights to the democracy that we celebrate. Tonight is about bringing together the counter-narratives that consider the nuances of race. A platform through which intellectuals specialising in different aspects of race will share and discuss their ideas, research, findings, and autoethnographies. To enable a space where these ideas can come together, outside of the framings we often encounter as a mass audience. Narratives that perpetuate hegemonic, dominant ideologies surrounding race. In a landscape where academics of colour are lacking in a voice and agency, I am grateful to Central's deanery in enabling me the opportunity to curate such an event. Particularly Ross Brown, Catherine McMara, Josh Abrams, John Sibley, Amanda Brennan, who's not here today, and Megan Hunter. I add thanks to all my colleagues in the State, Reception and DEA, and the SU Network of Colour, and student volunteers for their help in bringing this all together. I look forward to seeing what you put up on social media. The hashtag we're using tonight is Performing Race, all one word. And I would be most grateful if you would stay in touch, because I'm hoping that this will open up more conversations of a similar nature. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to the fantastic Nazir Afzal OBE, who will be chairing tonight's event and inviting each speaker on the stage to deliver an oral paper, which will be followed by an audience Q&A and discussion. After this event, we are holding a drinks reception upstairs in the canteen, and you're welcome to join us for that. I hope you enjoyed tonight's event, and thank you ever so much for coming.
I'm not derived from nobility like Joe. Yeah, I got an OBE. I'm really delighted to be here. I thank Joe for inviting me and for you giving up your Friday evenings to come here. You mentioned intellectual. Well, I'm not intellectual. I know nothing about this subject other than what I'm going to hear from our esteemed speakers very shortly. Hopefully, when we leave here, we'll be much more intelligent than we were when we came in. So I think that's the incentive. A little bit about my journey, because I think, I didn't really appreciate Jo was going to talk to you about her journey. My family come from the very traditional and tribalistic parts of Pakistan. They moved to the very traditional tribalistic parts of Birmingham, where I was born. And those of us who are old enough to remember the 60s and 70s, racism was extraordinarily overt. You had skinheads on the street. The number of times I was beaten or abused, I can't begin to tell you or share with you, but I remember telling those who were attacking me, sticks and stones may break my bones, but your words won't hurt me, and it worked, because after that it was only ever sticks and stones. And when you've been beaten black and blue, you go home and you just think, well, this is just part of growing up. It isn't. But that's exactly how we felt, that it was just part of growing up. It was part of being visitors. The point you made about Powell's speech, that somehow at some point they'll just tell us to go home. But I assumed that when you moved into professions, I became a lawyer a long time ago, I thought that that's it. Now I'm in a position of authority, in a position of establishment, that they'll stop being racist towards me. What a lie. Because I remember organizing, I used to organize all these conferences on areas of criminality that nobody else would touch. And so, for example, I organized one on sports crime, how the national conference, first ever, how the behavior of players on the pitch impacts on spectators, impacts on the wider society, which I'm sure you all agree. But I remember doing lots of interviews on national television, and I got so much hate mail. And one in particular, "Dear Mr. Afzal, we English invented football, please go back to Wogland." I remember looking at a globe and I couldn't find Wogland anywhere. But I found his name and address on the letter. And I reported to police. And that's what taught me, actually, that if you don't stand up to bullies, they feel they can do what they like to you. And again, I assume that, at some point, I became chief prosecutor, the first in 2001, 2003. I assumed at that time, now I'm not chief prosecutor. But strangely, all the newspapers, whenever they referred to me, it was always the Muslim chief crown prosecutor, or the British Pakistani chief crown prosecutor. And when I became chief executive of the Police and Crime Commissioners, it was the Muslim or British Pakistan. But when I'm a chair of a college, it's chair of the college. Or when I'm a member of this, that, and the other, I'm just a member of it. Suddenly, when you're in a position of influence, responsibility, dare I say it, power, your faith becomes important to people, or your background becomes important. I wonder why that might be. Yeah, I remember some of you watched the BBC film Three Girls. And that was based on my case. The actor who played me was much more handsome than I am. In fact, my wife's got a picture of him on the wall. But that case, it ended with the case finishing. What you don't know is what happened afterwards, because the far right's narrative is very straightforward, that all minorities are the same. And so when they discovered that I was the one that prosecuted the case, they went, uh-oh. And back in 2012, before we'd even talked about it, I certainly knew about it, they invented fake news on Facebook and other places, saying that I somehow didn't prosecute these guys. And they came for me. I don't know about you, I can't imagine any of you have had an EDL demonstration outside of your home. I have. I don't believe that any of you had a panic alarm placed in your house, a police officer outside your door for 3 weeks. You haven't tell your children that the Prime Minister has a police officer outside his door. They had to go to school for 3 months in a taxi, day in, day out. I got 17,000 emails in 1 week to my teams calling for me to be sacked and deported. Now, as I say, I love Birmingham, but I don't want to go back there, right? But they made it abundantly clear that I damaged their narrative and they were going to come for me. And I was the chief prosecutor, and I was the one that made all the right decisions in that case when others had failed. That's racism. That's my experience. And very recently, actually, I haven't even shared this with anybody, I've spoken at the Local Government Association National Conference, I've spoken at the National Police Chiefs Conference, I've spoken at the National Colleges Conference, and when I walked in, I increased the minority population of that conference by 100%. And they are your senior leaders. So we ask ourselves, and maybe some of our colleagues can answer this question, what happened? Macpherson was the beginning of a new world. And everything was going to change. How later, 20 years later, has it not? Why do I still feel that I'm still kicking down doors? And actually, it's worse than before Macpherson, because they now point to me and say, well, look, he did it. It's going to be easier for you lot. Rest assured, it wasn't easy for me, and it's harder for you. So we have to understand what's going on, and you're going to understand what's going on by listening to our colleagues. Let me start with Dr. Shona Hunter. If you've got your little booklet, which I hope you have, I'm not going to read Shona's biography. It's definitely not. But She's the current reader in the Carnegie School of Education at Leeds Beckett University. Come up, Shona.
Okay, so yeah, the stuff that I'm going to be talking to you about today, I've been kind of thinking through in lots of different ways, really over the past, well, over my life, but over the past kind of 10, 15 years. And it's stuff that I've written about, talked about, thought about in different ways, but that I'm bringing together in a much more kind of personal set of explorations in the work that I'm doing now. Kind of my background is thinking about governance, institutional politics, power and domination, and how that works in institutional spaces. I'm guessing that we might not get onto that. I'm trying to draw some links towards the end of my talk, but let's see how that goes. So this is me really thinking through kind of where I started off, thinking through kind of identities. And thinking through, in particular, formations of whiteness. And Reni Eddo-Lodge and many other really fabulous people in the kind of public domain have done me a real favour and us a real favour by kind of bringing conversation around whiteness and what that might mean as a form of kind of ethnic identification, as a political formation, for us in the English context over the last few years. But there's been a lot of academic work kind of going on in that area, and also public debate for a long time, but maybe framed in different sort of ways. Okay, so we've got whiteness really now in the public domain as a formation of institutionalized power, racist. I've put the colonial in brackets because that often gets left out. Histories of colonization still aren't talked about very explicitly. I'll be talking about some of those aspects in relation to kind of my own background. Colonial oppressions, and sometimes explicitly noted as being about domination of a racialized other. Now, whilst for many of us in the room that might not feel like a surprising narrative around whiteness, this idea of whiteness as a formation of power, as a violating way of being in the world, is very important, has started to come to the fore more recently, but is also one of the kind of primary sticking points, I think, for people who are invested in whiteness, like me, who are read as white and who embody whiteness. And so really what my work has been doing over the last kind of 10, 15 or so years has been thinking about how we can explore whiteness and its relationship to violence in more honest and kind of open and responsible ways, but also whilst understanding the nuances within that. So really it's, for me, has been about thinking about how can we engage with ideas of white domination and responsibility in a way which does not only create narratives of shame, guilt, and all of those sorts of things. And I have written a lot about shame, guilt, and how all of that stuff works. So I, kind of put myself in that category as well. As I just said then, so these sticking points really, and the key sticking point for me, and this is something that actually comes out in Reni Eddo-Lodge's book really nicely, I think. So this is the book, Why I'm Not Talking to White People About Race, yeah? If anybody needed the introduction, I don't know, maybe they didn't. But she kind of identifies this rock and a hard place in a way that we're in when we start to think about and talk to those of us who are, and the us there, I'm talking about me as a white person. I'm not necessarily understanding us all as invested in whiteness, although there is an argument around that as well that maybe we might talk about at some point. And Jo's kind of pointed towards, actually, in her own kind of biographical intro there. But yeah, this relationship between structural histories of violence and the agency for reparative work around race and racism and recognition of whiteness as being related to white individuals. And of course, white people get constructed as being individuals all the time, yeah? That's how we understand whiteness as a kind of, as the human kind of universal formation, right? That's a key part, fundamental part of how whiteness works, narrativizes itself as dominant. and pushes everybody else kind of aside, if we like. What I want to do then today is to start unpacking how we might think about the intersecting kind of relations of power and vulnerability which get enacted by, I'm using myself as an example, and my own kind of family situation and kind of context. So really the point of difficulty, I think, for most white folks when they're thinking about how is it that power operates through me when they don't always recognise themselves as powerful, is that they don't see themselves as the sorts of people that we were just talking about, right? So here we've got an example of an EDL protester, Joanne Dickinson. This comes from an EDL march a long time ago, 2011. She was captured in a video by some Unite Against Fascism campaigners, and in that video she was described as the most tattooed, horrible scrote of a woman, not a woman, a dog, right? So she gets positioned very easily outside of a norm of whiteness. These Palsgrave women protesters were women who were protesting, white working class women protesting against, for Sarah's Law a while ago. But these women who were protesting for a law which was about protecting their young working class children were being constructed by David Aronovich in the Observer, it was at the time, as an alien race to me. I mean, there's a lot more to that. So what I'm interested in is thinking about how these folks are constructed and how this relates to the example of somebody like me, who we might want to see as a specimen, I've put here, this is me describing myself, of the good white people kind. So Shannon Sullivan has just done some really interesting work in the United States, which looks about the ways in which white liberals position themselves as outside of power and domination discourses in relation to race and racism, okay? And really this is where I'm sure we won't get to talk about it much, but this is where my kind of core interest in institutional life kind of started off, really. It was understanding precisely this conundrum that we've just talked about before. How is it that when we know racism, racist domination and white supremacy is institutionalized, yet those who work in institutions are these good white folk, yeah? Okay, allegedly. And I'm that. That's me, right? That is the point. That is me. I embody that. So, right, I'm not going to go through the heavy theory here because I do want to get to the biography, and I hope what we'll do is be able to come back if we're interested, and you can kind of read articles and stuff. I think hopefully, the narrative I'll give you will give you some way into thinking about the theory. But what I've been doing is trying to think about whiteness and actually any forms of racialized identity formation. But in my case, this is about whiteness, right? Thinking about it in terms of a relational choreography. So that's a way of thinking about identities which isn't positioning identity as something that is individual, owned by the individual. It is something that is structured through histories of power and domination and also histories of vulnerability, right? And it's about understanding the multiplicities of those histories and how those past acts or past sets of relations frame our everyday embodied encounters. So this idea of relational choreography that I've been working with and developing brings in different ways of thinking about temporalities, about the past and the future as being in the present here and as working in the room with me and with you kind of now and with all of us. But this notion of a choreography brings in the idea of a kind of mise-en-scene. I mean, it really is. It comes from, I won't go into the details, we could be here all night, but of the different kind of sets of ideas that come together. But it is very much about thinking about a group of people constructing a racial formation together. So you could look at me as a person acting here in the room as effectively a racial formation, right? So the only difference between thinking about a nation and thinking about me is it relates to level of abstraction. So I'm just going to give you really a sense of the different aspects, and it can only be really, really fragmentary, but the different kind of aspects of my history that make me up, and that bring the violences that we like to position so far from ourselves as people who are read as white and who embody and are invested in whiteness together. Right, so, and I've called it Crafting a Livable Story of White Working Class Upward Mobilities, and hopefully it'll become clear why. So, this is where I was made. I was made in Birmingham in 1977. This picture and why I'm using it particularly will become clearer in a little while, hopefully. So the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies published this book, The Empire Strikes Back, at round about this point that I was born. And this was an absolutely crucial book for me as an individual, but really the work that was going on in the centre at that time was crucial. Because what it did was it situated a welfare capitalist state restructuring, which my family, you'll see, were centrally involved in, as all families in the country were, but particularly the white working classes, or the white lower working moving up to middle classes. It centralised really the construction of an authoritarian state which worked through the agencies of the state, the white state, and was containing and policing all sorts of black and brown communities in the context of the UK at that time, as a part of a national re-nationalising story. I don't know whether the conversation that Joe and I might have about nationalisms might be an interesting one. But anyway, okay, so so the sorts of things that Birmingham is associated with, and we've already talked about, we've got Enoch Powell in '68. A lot of people know a lot less about Malcolm X's visit to Smethwick. You'll see in a moment. I grew up literally just down the road from where that visit happened. UB40 has a very big central part in my life for various reasons, some of which are related to the police state, but that's for another day maybe. But they kind of represented all sorts of interesting, what are constructed as the positive multiculturalisms that were going on in Birmingham at that time also, right? So a mix of English, Scots, Irish, Yemeni, Jamaican folks who were getting together, making amazing music, were signing off the dole through that making of music. So there's a class narrative there. Okay, so where I grew up in all of this, you can't really see here, but I'm right on the edge in Quinton, just here on the left. This will become important in a moment. Right at the edge of Birmingham, edge of the suburbs. Some of the stuff that I'm talking about, just in the other pictures, went on there, Edgbaston, Hall Green, Moseley, Kings Heath. So in the same city, but far apart. So Anoop Nayak says this of the shift to the suburbs as the last bastion of whiteness. Suburban spaces may be conceived through a silent cartography of whiteness in which home ownership, nuclear families, white-collar commuting, and feelings of safety preside. Now, I think that's really important when you think about the slide I just showed you and some of the slides I'm going to show you in a minute. So, the prefabs in Wolverhampton, where my dad and his and my aunts grew up. 1984 in Oldbury. We've got lots of kiddie photos, haven't we? So there's me and my little brother. 1988 in Wolverhampton with my grandparents. So my grandma started off there and has ended up there. It's still pretty austere. It was the 80s, and they weren't that rich, to say the least. But there's a shift up. And then here we are. It is truncated. 2006 in Worcester at one of my auntie's houses. At a family 70th birthday kind of tea party thing. It wasn't anything to do with like a nationalist celebration. So I find it fascinating that these awnings were part of, you know, that kind of day. So this is one narrative. There's a class mobility here, okay? Whew. Right, I just want to read this and then talk about a counter-narrative. So if I take one more minute, am I allowed? Okay. So, moving into the white middle classes, right, means moving into a white middle class fantasy of insecurity. So this comes from Willoughby Herod's more recent work, where she's developing a narrative in relation to the white Afrikaans population in South Africa, and she's drawing on Sennett and Cobb's work. Now, there's part of my work that I'm not talking about today, which draws together all of these international connections, which I also think is important. So there's a reason I was using this. But basically, what Sennett and Cobb recognised in post-war kind of US mobility structures was the problems. The upward mobility constituted a disorienting bundle of affective challenges for the white working classes. It produced a morbid form of self-doubt that was propped up by the pursuit of individual achievement, demonstrating that one is different from all of the rest. So, whiteness as misery, traditional misery narrative around whiteness. We get a lot of that now around the white working classes. Okay, and there's something to that, right? There's not that there's nothing to this. However, when we're thinking about resisting racism as a form of domination that dominates me as well as all of us in the room, and I'm using the us there very deliberately, only that part of the narrative is not helpful. So, on its own, right? I think that narrative is partly about crafting a livable story of whiteness, right? Which excavates and excises the pain that we meter out on others as well as ourselves, okay? So, part of the broader project of re-engaging with thinking about whiteness and its relationship to violence is about the interruption of a mythology of the white individual self. So I talked earlier about individualization, right? So something that I've been working on, and again, the idea of this relational choreography is about seeing myself as a white person, as situated, as objectified, being able to objectify myself, fix myself, through these narratives around power, domination, and how those things relate to other aspects of myself. So, again, I can't talk about the context of my relationship to all of this stuff, but I have them. So this is Vanley Burks. I don't know whether many of you know of Vanley Burks' work, but he is a black British, probably one of the most prominent, famous black British photographers working in the English context at the moment, documenting black life in the context of, and I'm using black there in a political sense, big B, right? In the context of Birmingham, right by all of those places that I showed you, okay? So, I'm not using Vanley's amazing crowd shots and all of this sort of stuff. There's some parts of Vanley's work which really interest me, and I'll tell you why. Look, a white. So that's a riff off Yancey, and off Yancey's use of Fanon. So this is about being able to see what white people look like from people who don't get positioned through whiteness, right? This is what they look like. All the same time, right? Okay, so the other thing that I didn't tell you about my family narrative is that my dad was policing in Birmingham at this time. So one of the things that is very important, I think, for us to think about, and I'm wrapping up. Have I got to do it now? Yep. So one of the things that I'm trying to do here with drawing together these threads is to really get us to start thinking about the closenesses of the violences that are perpetrated, that we imagine are perpetrated kind of by others. You know, my dad is a lovely, loving guy. I love him dearly. He loves me. And we, as a family, have produced, you know, somebody who does this work. But that is there. And that's what I bring into institutional spaces with me. So I think we'll leave that. I got to where I thought I'd get to. Sorry, we didn't get the true choreography.
I feel like Dr. Evil, just telling people to, hurry up. But anyway, out of fairness to the other speakers, we've got to keep to time. And we do get an opportunity, and as Joe said, questions and answers. Maybe we can develop some of the thoughts that Shona has just shared with you. So can I now ask Professor Andrews to come up? I saw Professor Andrews recently with Piers Morgan, if I remember rightly. Professor in Black Studies at Birmingham City University. You won't know this, actually. My son applied to Birmingham City University. So we'll see how he gets on.
Good evening. All right. So we're talking about performing race, and to do that, one of the things we have to do is really understand what race is, right? And it's become really apparent to me that we don't, right? Typically, we conflate race with lots and lots and lots of different things. In fact, and I promise you this will be the only plug for the book I'm going to do today. I'm just currently, I'm actually usually I'm talking about the book. It's strange, I'm usually pulling a trolley of books around, but I'm not today. The book is Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. And in that book, actually, one of the main things I do is say, we've understood race wrong, and we've conflated race and blackness. See, for me, I write about blackness, black politics, black radicalism, black studies, black this, black that, right? Blackity black, you could say. And one of the things that's really important to do is to separate out the concept of something like blackness and something like race. Because we have to really understand what we're talking about when we're talking about race. So, very briefly, race is not just an idea, it's not just a set of exclusions. I mean, race is a structure. Race is in the political economy. Race is the thing that underpins all social life in Western capitalism. You cannot have what we have today without race. It is literally, I mean, literally everything that is built today is founded on race. I'll plug the second book because I'm writing it right now, which is The West is Built on Racism. And in a very real way, race and racism is the founding thing that underpins everything. Right? So race is really in the political economy. So when we're talking about race, we're talking about the political economy. And when we're talking about performing race, we're talking about performing categories which are produced by the political economy. That's really important because it does just tell you how deeply invested these categories are and how also it's almost impossible to shake them, right? Because they're part of the fabric of what we have, right? The best way to understand this is to understand what is the emergence of what we have, the West, modernity. I mean, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Do they still sing that in schools? I don't know. We learned that when I went to school anyway. Right? But that really is a really important date, right? 1492, the expansion of Europe into the Americas. That is the founding point of the West. And what happens at the founding point of the West? One of the worst genocides in history of humankind. When Columbus landed, they reckon there was about 72 million natives in the Americas and the Caribbean. Within a generation, 96% of those people were dead. I mean, just think about that. That's just one. That's just the start. Then you got slavery, colonialism, etc. So if you add up everything that builds the rest, really, the West is built on a principle of white supremacy, right? Why can you take the land from the natives? Because they're not really people. When you've killed most of the natives and you need labor, why can you go to Africa and take hundreds of millions of people for 300 years? Because they're not really people either. Why can you then go and expand and colonize and why can the British Empire be the empire that the sun never sets on? Because none of us were really human beings. We weren't fully people. White supremacy, white at the top, black at the bottom, right? Claude Linnaeus, who was a Swedish botanist, and whose name actually still is on a university, very, very, very well regarded in Sweden, is the best probably example of this. He was a scientist, botanist, and in one of his books in the 18th century, he basically categorizes people the way that you categorize plants. And he says there's different categories, right? Number one is Europaeus albus, sanguine, liberty-loving, governed by law, and white, right? American rubiscus, tanned and irascible, governed by custom. And then you have just down the pole, down the pecking order, is Asiatic viridis, yellow, melancholy, governed by will. And then at the bottom of this pole, there is Afro-Niger, crafty, lazy, black, governed by the arbitrary will of the master. Right? That is white supremacy. That is racial capitalism. And that is actually a very good description of the global inequality, right? Where's the rich parts of the world? The white parts of the world. Where's the poorest parts of the world? Africa. And then everywhere else is kind of in between, right? So when I say race is in the political economy, this is what I mean, right? Those basic principles still govern social life. Now, importantly, this creates particular categories of race and of belonging, understanding. One of the really central important categories is what Cedric Robinson calls the Negro. And the Negro is somebody who has no civilization, has no culture, has no history, is more beast than is a human being, right? That's my ancestors, right? Slaves. This is the justification of slavery. This is why the founding fathers of America can talk about freedom and for everybody while they own slaves, because they really don't think that we're people. The key founders of the Enlightenment, John Locke, the British, one of the main British thinkers in the Enlightenment, fundamentally believed that Native Americans, Africans, did not have the capacity to hold land, right? These ideas perpetuate through. So you have this category of the Negro, the brute, who can be literally can be disposed of. There's a really famous, well now famous, story of the slave ship Zong. Have you come across this? So the Zong is 1780s. I'm not a historian, so really don't ask me dates, right? 1781, I think it was. And the slave ship captain gets in trouble. They can't feed everybody. They run out of water, so they throw their cargo overseas, into the sea. This is what people did a lot. Their cargo just happened to be 132 Africans. Right? Now this came to the courts. It did not come to the courts over an issue of murder. It came to a courts over an issue of whether the slave ship captain could claim insurance for his losses. And this is the whole way it was debated. In the actual ruling of this case, Lord Chief Mansfield, the Chief Justice at the time, says very clearly that this should not be treated any differently than if it were horses and cattle thrown overboard. That is the Negro. Now, that's important performatively as well, because then that has a real performance, right? This character that has no culture, that has no civilization, becomes something that gets acted out, and you can see it very clearly in performances. Performances at the time, Hottentot Venus, as they called her, Sata J. Bartman, right? Somebody who could be paraded around, big breast, big bottom, that's a Negro woman, right? The coon shows, which were common at the time as well, right? Black people are only for entertainment, right? Culture, not really culture, just for entertainment. Yeah? You still see gollywogs, right? I mean, gollywogs are still in existence today, and the gollywog is a perfect example of that kind of grinning, smiling coon. And these images you can't detach those images from that history of the Negro. That is where those images come from. And we do collude in these as well. Lenny Henry, who is now my boss, I guess, in some ways. No, I don't know. He's the chancellor of the Birmingham City University. Where did he get his big break? In the 60s, 70s? Doing the black and white minstrel show on BBC. Right? I mean, crazy thing. But you see these performances very clearly. You also see these kind of cooning minstrel performances in other ways. So what's one of the ways that the Negro really is defined is around hypersexualization, being that kind of bestiality is in this kind of, this, which I guess sometimes you can embrace, I guess, as a stereotype, but probably shouldn't, right? This idea that black, with this hypersexual, this beast, right? You hear that, you can see that very, very clearly. And particularly in TV. I mean, this is an area where you see it today all the time, right? What was one of the most popular shows recently? Top Boy. I mean, Top Boy is terrible. I mean, Top Boy is really just the Negro on display, right? What do black men do? This is what they do, right? You can see that kind of thing in gangster rap, hip hop, drill that we have nowadays, right? There's a very particular representation of blackness which is being portrayed, and the roots of that portrayal really is in this idea of the Negro, right? Who can think, who can not think, what do we do, et cetera, right? So that's the bottom of the totem pole, very important, the Negro. You go up a little bit further, and it's not really that much further up, but it's a bit further up, and you have what Edward Said talks about with Orientalism, right? So the other, the colonial other, how we look at people from, what we would call Asia in the UK, South Asia, right? Has anybody seen the film 300? Older film. I mean, it's a perfect example of Orientalism. You have 300 really tightly wound, civilized white people fighting against these hordes of these sexualization's in there. It's all these magics in there, and he's got these hordes of brown people, right? If you look at something like Islamophobia, why do we fear Muslims so much? Because they're the other, right? The Oriental other. There's a long history to this idea, a very, very, very long history, which ties into this idea of white supremacy. And you can still see that these things are being performed and played out again and again and again. I think it was Riz Ahmed wrote a really compelling piece about the roles that he can play. Nowadays, because he's Riz Ahmed, he gets a bit more flexibility. But coming up, there's only certain roles that brown people can play, right? And it's, again, you can't separate that from the history of white supremacy. And then obviously at the top of the totem pole, you have whiteness. And whiteness is race. We often forget this. Whiteness is one of the most clearly racialized ideals. And if you want to look in performative terms, in terms of media, I'll give you two words: Downton Abbey. I mean, there you go, hegemonic whiteness. You can see, but honestly, turn on British television, you can see hegemonic whiteness everywhere. Like most things, it's just hegemonic whiteness. These period dramas. Why do we keep telling the same stories again and again and again? Right? Because there's a particular version of whiteness which we love to see. Right? Very well spoken, very posh, very aristocratic, superior in the country. You know, there's a real particular version of whiteness that's being portrayed. And that whiteness is very, very much about superiority. And we can see this very clearly, very, very, very clearly today. And again, it's really important because these are linked into stuff. So if you were to map the roles that people can play, and in the theater this is the same, in dance this is the same. You know, culturally, we see these roles perpetuated again and again and again. But this really does relate to the political economy of racism and the political economy of white supremacy. How long have I been talking about? 5 minutes left. All right. That's good, perfect. All right, good. So, all right. One of the things I want to add to that definitions of whiteness, though, is that for me, whiteness is actually a psychosis. That's what I mobilized in the book, actually, psychosis. This idea that actually these are delusional ideas that you can't really rationalize them. You can't really teach them out. Because the reason that we have these ideas of whiteness as being wonderful and blackness as being bad and et cetera, is because of what? The political economy. To actually understand the history and the true relations of the way the world works, not just historically, but today. What did I say at the start? Map out global inequality and you will see very clearly white supremacy. A child dies every 10 seconds because they have not proper access to food. Every single one of those children is black or brown. That's today. That's not 100 years ago, right? So if we were really to understand what that means and what that means to all of us, and actually that does include us who are not white in the West, then we would have to change stuff, right? We'd have to do stuff. We'd have to give up the privilege which kills children. But because we don't want to do that, we have these delusional ideas, these delusional fantasies that somehow we're progressive, that somehow things are getting better. And actually one of the best places to see this is in movies. So actually the psychosis of whiteness came about when I was watching the film Belle. You seen the film Belle? You like it? Enjoy it? That Belle is terrible. Jeez, my God, that was one of the, I mean, literally, if you want to see the psychosis of whiteness, watch that film, right? So that film is, one, let's just pick out, Belle Dido is a real person, did exist, was the daughter of an aristocrat and an enslaved African. The aristocrat took her out of slavery and put her in this mansion. When I say this, the psychosis starts there. She's probably the only one, like literally the only one. If you wanted to pick a story representative of slavery at the time, this is the least representative story you could possibly pick, right? I mean, it's just like the one exception. Puts Belle in one of these period dramas. So if you actually watch it, it's more like watching Downton Abbey, probably. Actually, that's kind of that is the structure of the movie, right? It's a romance, it's a Jane Austen type novel that somehow revolves around slavery. Also has the Zong case. So I mentioned the Zong earlier. The Zong case is a central feature of this film. However, the Zong case is taken as this huge blow to slavery because what happens in the end is that Chief Justice Mansfield rules against the slave owners, the slave ship captain, and says you can't claim insurance. This is taken in the film to be, this great blow to slavery. Absolute nonsense. I mean, just look at historically. This case happens in 1781. Slavery continues in the British Empire until 1838. That's a long time, right? Also, this case, the way the case is represented is completely fictional. In fact, the case at the time was nobody cared about it. It wasn't actually, it was routine. This was a routine case. It only became big about 20 years after the case because it was a really good story for the abolitionists to tell. 130 people drowned, went to court, no, it didn't. But that's why. It had no impact on slavery at all. If anything, it underpinned slavery. No, it didn't take it away, it underpinned it. Because what do you need for slavery to work? You need insurance. In fact, insurance starts in slavery. The insurance business, insuring is the first things that insured are slave ships. And this ruling actually underpins the insurance of it. Because if anybody could just throw people aboard and claim insurance, nobody would insure slaves, and that would actually have been the end of slavery. The opposite result would have been the result which had a more impact on slavery. Worse than that, the film paints Mansfield as an abolitionist. It actually quotes him incorrectly, saying that slavery is an abomination, when, again, in this case, this was the case where he said it is no different than it was horses or people. He was not an abolitionist, it was not an abolitionist event. Belle was not some liberated black woman living in this countryside. It was a totally fictional portrayal. Now, really importantly about this, because I do want to get to this complicity, the writer and director of Belle were black women, actually. Amara Sante, who directed the film, actually explains that she chose this story in particular because she wanted to give young black women a place in that kind of Jane Austen type narrative in that history. This is not the place of black women in that history. It really isn't, right? There is a place. This is not it. And part of the problem is that we have started to collude in writing ourselves out, in colluding in this idea of white supremacy and whiteness. And until we can think differently, we can really never change anything at all. And I'll stop there.
Can I ask for Dr. Christine Checinska to come up now? Again, the biography is in your little program. Associate Researcher at WE.B, University of Johannesburg, and Visiting Tutor at the Royal College of Art.
Wonderful. So here we are. So thank you, Joe, for inviting me to speak. And it's great to see all of you here. And it's wonderful to have this opportunity to share some of my thoughts around race and performing race and blackness versus race. So in fact, the actual title of my paper is Arise Sir Galahad! And that's really important. And I want to look at masks, masquerade, and masculinity in Sam Salvon's Lonely Londoners, which some of you might have read. By way of visually contextualizing the paper, I'm hoping that my little slideshow will play. In a way, I've chosen this as my context because my parents were part of what I would describe as the picture post generation. I feel we hear about the Windrush generation, but the picture post generation arrived in 1956 at the height of migration from the Caribbean to Britain, where migration from the Caribbean was spoken of suddenly as a problem, or more blatantly as a problem. And we have articles like the Picture Post article, 30,000 colour problems, and that's 1956 when my parents arrived. And that's in contrast to this 1948 moment where the newspapers read kind of romance in the air. You know, Westward Ho is one of the titles in a daily paper. And it's the idea of the arrival is romanticized. And less than 10 years later, we get 30,000 colour problems. So this is really, we can tell it. Can we tell that music? Is it possible? So it's really just places us in that 1948 moment.
Because the English people are very much sociable. They take you here and they take you there and they make you feel like a millionaire. So London, that's the place for me. At nights, when you have nothing to do, you can take a walk down Shaftesbury Avenue. There you would laugh and talk and enjoy the breeze and admire the beautiful scenery of London. That's the place for me. Yes, I cannot complain of the time I have spent. I mean, my life in London is really magnificent. I have every comfort and every sport, and my residence is at Hampton Court. So London, that's the place for me.
So I want to formally begin by setting this presentation into the context of my wider research. My concern is the relationship between culture, fashion, and race. A strand of my work analyses what is, in my view, the creolised aesthetic of the Empire Windrush and Picture Post generations. The crux of this research lies in the examination of the presentation of the African Caribbean male body during the late 1940s through to the 1950s. And it's a period that I would describe as colonising in reverse, to invoke Miss Lou. I found that there's a relative absence of academic work that investigates male African Caribbean dress from an English perspective from my perspective, and I'm interested in that absence. Indeed, little attention has been given to the African Caribbean presence as a whole and its ongoing influence on English culture. In my opinion, the equation of this presence with race has sometimes limited the field of inquiry, so differences often first thought of racially and not culturally. And I think that's tied to what Kehinde has just been talking about. As black people, often we're not seen as having a history, we're not seen as having a culture. And so that's what I mean there. But what captures my imagination is the theatre of fashion, the construction of masculine identities through props, such as a suit or a hat deliberately placed to one side, and the staging and performance of arrival. Masculine identity is seen by me as a multidimensional psychosocial construct, the characteristics being created and communicated through representation and through material culture, one element of which is dress. In essence, dress is seen as a pivotal tool within the construction and performance of masculinities, a mask within the masquerade of masculinity. My aim then is to examine Sam Salvon's use of masking in the creation of the character Sir Galahad, looking not only at dress, but also at the renaming of the character and the suggestion of blackness itself as a kind of mask. I then want to consider African Caribbean masculinities as a kind of masquerade rooted in an Afro-Creole cultural heritage that springs from slavery and colonization. The Lonely Londoners was also published in this infamous year, 1956, and when 25,000 West Indians, as we would have been called then, arrived in England. And with this in mind, I want the concluding section of my paper to briefly consider the interaction between masking, identity and difference, pointing to issues of power and representation that we've already touched on tonight. According to the British Museum's Africa, in inverted commas, this is the gallery text in one of the Africa galleries, masquerade is an art of transformation. Masquerades often occur at the changes of season and rites of passage. They often maintain and express the secret knowledge of insider groups. This definition, in particular the understanding of masquerade as an art of transformation, offers a starting point and underpins my discussion. The notion of transformation, in turn, highlights some key issues about representation, mediation, power, motivation, and performance. However, a fundamental difference between African Caribbean masquerade and the European carnival of bark tin is that within Afro-Creole or African Caribbean culture, masquerade signifies not only the destabilization of order through the art of transformation, but also has at its center an intensification or caricature of the everyday. So Barkton's high-low culture dynamic is replaced by a private-public or an inside-outside dynamic. So let's move on to Salvon. Henry Oliver Esquire his arrival from Trinidad, and I quote, "one grim winter evening when it had a kind of unrealness about London, with a fog sleeping restlessly over the city and the lights showing in a blur as if it was not London at all, but some strange place on another planet," is marked in the opening pages of Salvon's book by Henry's mythical, almost surreal, bleary-eyed entrance through the smog and grime of the Waterloo station, where he's met by Moses Alouetta, an established inhabitant of the big city. The maiden knight awakens from a dream, disembarking the boat train once the other passengers have already disappeared. And he disembarks into this alien world created by Salvon, where a heatless sun hangs in the air like a force-ripe orange. It's not until the penultimate paragraph of the first section of the book that Salvon introduces us to Henry's alias. And it's not clear whether it's Henry himself that has arrived with his pet name, Sir Galahad, in place, or whether it's Moses, having scrutinized this specimen who ran up from the sunny tropics on a powerful winter evening, wearing a tropical suit and saying he ain't have no luggage, that christens him with his aristocratic title. At this point, Selvon lapses into semi-heroic language. Thus it was that Henry Oliver Esquire, alias Sir Galahad, descend on London to swell the population by 1. And 8.5 months later, it had a Galahad Jr. in Ladbroke Grove. So touching on what Kehinde was just saying. My reading of the text suggests that it's Moses, the reluctant mentor, who renames his charge, mirroring the process of seasoning seen throughout the Caribbean plantation slavery system, whereby newly arrived Guinea slaves were renamed, their African names removed. Once sold, they would be placed with an established slave originating from their region and speaking a similar dialect, not necessarily the same dialect, and they would act as a guide in much the way that Moses acts as a guide for Sir Galahad. And much like Sir Galahad of medieval romance, the Sir Galahad of Mallory and Tennyson, Selvon's urban knight is depicted as a heroic figure, having an insurmountable capacity for adventure. His zest for life and his cockiness, together with his determination to make it big, to make a mark in England, dismissing Moses' advice to return to Trinidad on the next steamer, parallels for me the spirit of daring displayed by Mallory and Tennyson's Knights of the Round Table in search of the Holy Grail. Both have an air of bravado or youthful courage about them. Tennyson's Galahad, for example, describes himself as a maiden knight. To me is given such hope, I know no fear. While Selvon's Trinidadian Sir Galahad's optimism and expectation is captured by his response to Piccadilly Circus. And I just want to read a section of Selvon, because the writing, I think, is just wonderful. It really places it. Always, from the first time he went there to see Eros and the lights, that circus have a magnet for him. That circus represent life. That circus is the beginning and ending of the world. Every time he go there, he have the same feeling like when he see it the first night. Drink Coca-Cola. Any time is Guinness time. Bovril and the fireworks, a million flashing lights, gay laughter, the wide doors of the theatres, the huge posters, the everyday batteries. Rich people going into tall hotels, people going to the theatre, people sitting and standing and walking and talking and laughing, and buses and cars, and Galahad Esquire. In all this, standing there in the big city, in London, oh Lord. As the book progresses, the character develops. The conspicuously underdressed Henry Oliver disappears behind a mask of his newly acquired title. Galahad feel like a king living in London. Turning now to Selvon's second masking technique, it's the suit, specifically an old grey tropical suit worn without overcoat, muffler or gloves that is the defining visible marker of Sir Galahad's character. Selvon denotes several pages of narrative to Galahad's appearance, detailing his dress style, the influence on it, the ritual of dressing itself, the ceremony surrounding the commissioning of a new suit from a Charing Cross tailor in preference to an East End one. And I want to look firstly at the briefing of the tailor, and then I'll discuss... Oh my goodness. Really? 5 minutes? Crikey, okay. So Galahad's knowledge of trend and discernment when commissioning his suit surprises his tailor. The narrator also tells us that it's impossible to palm off slack work on Galahad, implying an eye for quality and a level of perfection in dress that's not displayed elsewhere in his meagre life. It seems quite incongruous to have him snatching a pigeon for dinner in Kensington Gardens in one paragraph and literally spending money on an expensive suit in another. Clearly, appearance and self-presentation is a priority. So why is there an apparent fascination with dress? And how does dress relate to common representations or definitions of black masculinity? Is it the case that the suit on a white man and a suit on a black man do not always mean the same things? The tailor at Hardy Ames, writing on the Englishman's suit, observed, civilizations mean a respect for law and order, an appreciation of invention and beauty. It upholds tradition. The whole of the English-speaking world wears a suit. So does the whole of Europe. America does, of course. Today, the American gentleman dresses like an Englishman. Dark skins, in inverted commas, dark-skinned Americans wear suits. They choose their shirts and ties to wear with them with an accurate eye. They wear hats with a brim well over their eyes, like guards' officers, with a mixture of amusement and arrogance. And obviously, by dark-skinned Americans, he means African Americans. I'm just going to jump ahead. Using Kamal Brathwaite and Paul Gilroy's hypothesis, I'm thinking of Gilroy's Black Atlantic here, it's possible to make a link between the wearing of the suit by African-American zoot suiters, if you like, if people know that term, and African-Caribbean arrivants in Britain, and also African-Caribbeans in the Caribbean. So in my view, Sir Galahad displays a kind of zoot approach to dress. And when dressing for a date, one of the key pieces, one of the key accessories is the zoot suitor's long watch chain that some of you might have seen. So it's as though he kind of destabilizes those sartorial indicators of a particular Western Judeo-Christian definition of masculinity. So this idea of the suit representing tradition and order and whiteness, in inverted commas, or the authority of whiteness, is disrupted by the zoot suitor's watch chain. I'm just going to jump ahead because I've probably got 2 minutes left. Okay. So I would have talked a little bit about the role of dress in the crossing of borders. And I could plug my TED talk at this point while I flick forward, because that's what my TED talk is about, disobedient dress. I really want to get my concluding section, because it feels really important. I feel it ties to what you were just saying, Kehinde. So I go on to talk about masculinity, and it's almost as though, because we have been represented as outside the human race, not part of the human race. And because if you think we were stripped at a certain point within enslavement, we know the power of what it is to be dressed, like no other race, I would argue. And so I'm going to move now to my concluding paragraph. So in my view, slavery is a matrix. It's not a solely historical event, which I think is tied to what you were saying. So viewing slavery as a matrix rather than a solely historical fact, Henry Oliver's transformation into Sir Galahad becomes more than a masculine masquerade. His performance is motivated by a desire to be seen as a man, his desire to be seen as a man of status. And I would argue that Henry's desire is actually for personhood, is for rehumanization, and the suit is a tool within his quest for rehumanization. So in the end, there's more to Galahad than meets the eye. He's much more than a playboy, more than a trickster. His quest is not only for the big life in England, in London. His quest is for the holy grail of personhood. Thank you.
I have to keep apologizing to everybody that 20 minutes flies by far too fast. Can I ask, our next speaker is Dr. Michael McMillan. Again, the biography is extraordinarily full. Writer, playwright, artist, curator, scholar. How many things haven't you done? Dr. Michael McMillan.
Thank you, Joe, for inviting me to come and do something here tonight. I don't want to really speak tonight as an academic. I want to speak as a practitioner, as a theatre practitioner, as a playwright, as an artist. So the images here I had arranged them was on a time sequence, so they just did their thing as a kind of meditation in terms of what I'm doing, but they're not doing that, so I'm going to click it whenever. Oh, cool, cool. Now in the 90s, it's like now in the noughties, it's like I got 80% written on my back. I'm looking at a woman, she looks at me, she looks at a bag, and she grabs the bags and turns to the side. All I wanted to do was tell her that a bag was open. Or sometimes I'm standing at a bus stop, and I'm thinking, instead of being a rude boy like I normally do, let me go and wait in the queue. But she's still watching me. Oh my God, this man's gonna do something to me. Oh my God, this man's gonna do something to me. Oh my God, this man's gonna do something to me. I brought the milk, Miss LMA. Where do you want me to put it in the bedroom, Miss LMA? Why are you taking off your clothes, Miss LMA? What do you mean, Miss LMA? Miss LMA? No, Miss LMA. What if Master comes, Miss LMA? What if I come? And the bag slowly slips to the other side. You can feel her edging forward into the next woman. I don't want to feel like I'm pressurizing the woman, but something will make me just want to lurch for the bag. I just want to freak her out. I just want to freak her out. I just want to freak her out. But you can't do that, because the minute you do that, a Babylon is on your back. So I stand back and I bump into the next woman who's hiding her bag as well. This piece is No White Woman, I Don't Want Your Handbag. It's from a performance piece called Brother to Brother. I recently saw Reezy Kinde's powerful performance piece, Misty, in which he meditated about the trope of race in theatre and the arts generally, that many black artists find themselves having to negotiate, which is that we tend to only be given platforms to express our work as long as it addresses race. And as long as we do so, where we bare our souls and make naked when, where, why, how, and who our struggles are, our fears, joys, and pain, in a style that is culturally, socially, politically, and historically authentic. And in that psychic vice, black artists bear the burden of representation rather than themselves as artists who happen to be black. Now, in thinking about this question of race, performing race, I had considered making this whole presentation about the performance of whiteness, because white people don't see themselves as a race. And thank you, Shona, for your intervention, even though they invented the concept to legitimize their own colonial and imperial violence on and abuse and exploitation of those who designated as the racial other. I hasten to add, and I was going to say, actually, I hasten to add, I'm not referring to white people, but I think Shona's got a really good explanation about a kind of collectiveness of whiteness. But, you know, there's a paradox here in the kind of privilege of whiteness. The paradox is that the harbinger of violence portrayed themselves as the guarantors of peace, stability, and progress. But I decided against that event, and I would rather use some of my fear to work, Master Juba, Brother to Brother, and Invisible, to talk about performing black masculinities and black men loving black men as a revolutionary act. Now, living in a culture structured by colonial power and racial violence, I am witness to and participant in the black bodily experience as embodied as cultural memory, where there is trauma as process, in ways that colonial power and racism is perpetuated, that lives through the body, and in telling this story, this is a form of healing that speaks to power, in answering back, in call and response that connects the spiritual with the political. We have created masks to protect ourselves and survive. The African trickster spirit of Anansi, the cosmic power of Ashe, because we never knew when a love object might be wrested away. We wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. This debt we pay to human guile, with torn and bleeding arts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. Poor Lawrence Dunbar, lyrics of the Heathside. Black minstrelsy was the most popular form of entertainment on both sides of the Atlantic 150 years ago. And based on Love and Theft, as Eric Locke describes it, encapsulate a dialectic of white racial attraction and aversion, cultural appropriation born of cross-racial desire. Blackface arose in the minstrel show, but remains today everywhere we look. And I remember watching the black and white minstrel show on the BBC during the 1970s, was only came off the telly because it was considered racist. Just 100 years ago, they hunted us for game, or guinea pigs in their experiments, it's all the same. Their anthropology was an unending search for the precious au natural. Oh, I want to be like you, speak like you, dance like you, dress like you, sing like you, fuck like you. Master Juba was the inspiration behind writing, blackface was the inspiration behind writing Master Juba. I need a bit of water. I have some dental work going on here at the moment. I didn't wear my denture because I was afraid if I spot it out, it might drop on you, and I didn't want that to happen. So Master Juba was a play that I wrote, a historical drama about a real 19th century young black male dancer, William Henry Lane, who created tap dance. Charles Dickens saw him and wrote about him in New York. And as a result, Master Juba came to England. He performed Queen Victoria. But like most black performers during this period, Master Juba had to black up. So here's the conceit. He's a blacking up, playing a white man, playing a black man. Meanwhile, the Victorians were obsessed with civilization and civilizing the other, and which meant civilizing the body. Like whiteness, being civilized is defined by what it is not: the savage, the lascivious, the dangerous, the darkness, the other. Becoming civilized meant being the black body was making the black body acceptable to white people. Becoming civilized meant also civilizing the mind, keeping things on the surface, being respectable, socially compliant. Now, in the politics of respectability, a black middle-class ideology, respectability accommodates a neoliberal oppression while preaching the need for discipline and an aspirational culture as a corrective to the bad traits of the black poor. Ghetto mentality, welfare dependency, hoodies, pull up your pants, no sagging here. Patriarchy and historic black masculine performative strategies for survival, as expressed in the hyper-masculine cool posture. Like a black hole, it doesn't emit no emotion, because the continuation of that colonial process of trauma implodes. Invisible. In Ralph Ellison's 1952 novel Invisible Man, a black man falls into a hole. In the darkness, he discovers that he is invisible and alienated from the reality of his existence. He makes his black hole his home. He steals electricity from the grid and wires the ceilings on his home with 1,300 lights, and celebrates the advantages of his invisibility while listening to Louis Armstrong's jazz tune, What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue? This became the basis of Invisible, a one-man performance piece. I am an invisible man. No, I'm not spook. This is a prologue from the novel. You should read it. The prologue to the novel is an amazing piece. I am an invisible man. No, I am not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe or Stephen King. No, I'm one of those Hollywood ectoplasms, throwback to the days when we played the Uncle Tom, the Sambo Minstrel, the Black Brutal Buck, the Mammy, and the Tragic Mulatto, all won Oscars for it. No, I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquids. I even maybe was said to possess a mind. Frantz Fanon in Black Screen White Marks has much to say about the myths of the violent, aggressive, and animalistic nature of black male sexuality fabricated and fiction to allay the fears and anxieties of white men, while providing a means to justify the brutalization of the colonized and any vestiges of guilt. But in a sense, as Robert Staples suggests, there's an internalization of this mythology in a kind of black supersexuality. Black men have developed a penis as weapon hypersexuality, which perpetuates the stereotype and gives rise to exploitative use of our sexuality, trading up emotional expression as a performative strategy for survival. Bread and wine, your cross ain't so nearly as heavy as mine. While walking one night, I was arrested by my reflection in a shop window. It was me, and it wasn't me. It was another man. Who was he? Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the most handsome of us all? He was handsome, his face was black, his hair was thick, his lips were thick, with an upturned curve at the corners. His eyes were soft and gentle. He smiled. He wanted to share my joy and pain, my tears, my anger. He wanted to hold me, to take all my bitterness and hate away. He wanted me to make a confession, to heal all my wounds. He began to sing, brother to brother, brother to brother, brother to brother. I reached out to make a connection. He had gone. It had only been my reflection. Left in a vacuum, robbed of my past, anger came from nowhere now. I threw a brick at the window and smashed it. I stayed there for a while, watching me, watching you. Then I knew that I had to, what I had always done, run. And so I ran, and I ran, and I ran. Brother to brother, at this time in writing Brother to Brother, I was reading a lot of black women's literature, Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, Zora Hill Nelson, Paula Marshall, Sonia, the list, bell hooks. And it was kind of, in a sense, kind of exploring my own kind of feminization, in a sense. And this opened a path to films such as Langston, Isaac Julian's seminal work, Looking for Langston, the writings of Corbina Mercer, the photography of Rotimi Fanik and Cody, and the poetry of Essex Hemel. Brother to Brother, new writings by black gay men, edited by Essex Hemel and conceived by Joseph Beam, provided vocabulary for me to explore this side of this feminine side of my masculinity. The term brother to brother was further popularized in Marlon Rinks's film, Tongues Untied, which concerned the lack of dialogue between black men who formed erotic relationships with one another. The work did not limit itself to a black gay agenda, but opened up a discussion about the state of black masculinity as challenged by experiences of big faggotry. Issues of sexual politics, sexuality, and race were brought to me home during the year-long residency I did in Newcastle, where I worked with people infected and affected by HIV and AIDS. I eventually invited a group from the States called Pomo Afro Homos, postmodern African-American homosexuals, 3 black performers to perform in Newcastle at Drill Hall. They had a big success with their show, which we then moved from Newcastle to London. So in a sense, what a greater challenge to a black man's sense of himself is the discovery that he needs to form erotic relationships with other men. In Audre Lorde's seminal essay, The Uses of the Erotic, she describes the erotic as a measure between the beginning of our sense of ourself and the chaos of our strongest feelings, in reclaiming the confusion of the erotic from the pornographic. Lorde polarizes the joy and pleasure as a source of women's everyday power in the everyday, the true knowledge for understanding self, reconnecting the spiritual with the political. And in this locus of sensation, Lorde's conception of the erotic resonates with a reclaiming of the feminine in the masculine that begins with loving self. And if black men loving black men is a revolutionary act, then it begins with one loving of self. In October, I attended the 1 million, 95, I attended the 1 Million Men March in America because it was a black men's space, really. And taking that kind of idea, I also worked with a group called the Hittite Empire, a group of black male performers from the States. And it was that which then inspired me to create a black British male narrative, because that narrative tends to be dominated by our brothers and sisters across the pond. With Benji Reed, Anthony Econdero Lennon, who's just recently in the news, but I'm not going to go into that for a moment, and Michael Monash Denvers, we created Devised Peace, and we began to daily, with the 4 of us, explore questions around what reminded us today that reminded you that you're a black man before you got to this session, exploring our sense of loneliness, why we do, what we don't know what we do, and not loving ourselves and others. The material from these kind of sessions became the basis of the performance piece, Brother to Brother. I was also reading Nkazaka Shanga's For Colored Girls Who Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough, a seminal Korea poem where she uses the colors of the rainbow to signify personas, and so all of the personas in the piece are red, blue, and purple. And then we went on tour with the piece. Well, we had And this is the pragmatics of theatre. We didn't have a budget for a set or anything. So what we did was to create a red, gold, and green flag, Union Jack, and we used that as a prop. Our wheels, 2 minutes. My daddy taught me that I must be perfect. I was weak if I cried. I had to know everything, that feelings only got in the way. I am ashamed because I failed to hold my family together as a father, like son. Daddy, don't read the newspaper, I'm talking to you. Dad, turn off the TV, turn off the radio. This is not cricket, Dad, it's me. Remember that time when I came second in that competition? I came home with the trophy, about the same size as your own. I put it down with the certificate on the TV. You made a cup of tea and decided to put it on my certificate. Remember that, Dad? Remember that big brown stain over my name? Next day, my face was in the newspaper. You got to the center page. All the paper, all the family were waiting for you. We'd all seen it, but you skipped over it like there was nothing there. Remember, like you were frightened to see it, it's the same paper. Go to the middle page, look at it. If you can, that's me. That's your son. I'm your legacy. Thank you.
Last but not least, Dr. Karamat Iqbal, continuing the Birmingham takeover of the Embassy Theatre. Dr. Iqbal.
This is a quote from my book called Dear Birmingham, which came out 5 years ago, and it's a comment on Pakistani exclusion in Birmingham. And in that I say, for me, Birmingham is a very special place. It has been my home not just since 1970, but going back to the 1950s, when my father came here and others from our family and community helped to regenerate the city. They sweated in the local factories and foundries, in conditions and at rates of pay which were unacceptable to the local population, and living in overcrowded houses which had been abandoned by the indigenous population. The city is where I have received the best of my education, having begun life sitting on the dusty floor of my primary school in Kashmir and later on the bench of my secondary school over there. I have been able to access the best education on offer, with more to come as I near the completion of my PhD. That was written 5 years ago. Since then, I've been able to finish my PhD. Where else would that have been possible but here, in this land of opportunity? It was here that I fell in love with music and literature, and later, love of a different kind. A brief look at identity. A number of writers, you can see, have pointed out that we learn about ourselves when we're in the company of other people, people who are different from us. The reaction of others shapes us. In his Anti-Semite and Jew, Sartre spoke of children who by age 6 knew they were Jews because they'd been called Yids. And yet others were quite old by the time they discovered that they were Jewish. Stuart Hall, identity bridges the gap between our inside and the outside, between the personal and the public worlds. For him, it was a process, a narrative, a discourse. And he also said it owes something to the other. Stuart Hall came in 1951 to Birmingham. Well, no, to Oxford first, and then later to Birmingham. He was a Rhodes Scholar. We learned that he had not heard anybody either call themselves or refer to anybody else as black. It was after his first visit back to Jamaica that he began to think of himself as black, as immigrant. And you'll find the one reference that I didn't include in the references on the last slide is the thing he wrote called Old and New Identities, Old and New Ethnicities. We also learn from Fanon in Black Skin and White Masks that Fanon discovered himself as a black man thanks to calling out by a white Parisian child. And all of this, the key factor is the visibility. We, as black people, as visible minorities, stick out in the white Western world. The black visibility was a problem a long time ago, times of Queen Elizabeth I, when there was shortage of food, and one of the recommendations she made was the blacks, the blackamoors, as they were called, should be deported. I too discovered my identity when I found myself amongst others in this country as a 12-year-old in 1970, having grown up in Pakistani Kashmir. We had never considered identity. I had never considered identity. Upon arrival in the UK, first day in my first school, a tall white boy lifted me up against the wall in front of my class peers. The teacher was not there. I remember it very clearly and can feel the terror even now. So you don't discuss race with minorities like me without the emotions. The white boy who lifted me up as a 12-year-old vulnerable boy, he said to me, "We don't want any more effing Pakis." Some of the white kids laughed. I can hear it now. I'm not sure what was going on for my fellow Pakistani students. There were a few of them in the class. They were probably too scared to speak out. So I learned I was a Paki. What did this mean? What was I going to do about it? Live in fear for the rest of my school days and beyond, or confront it head on? My parents were in Pakistani Kashmir. I was living with my sister here. I probably went home in response to the question, well, how was your first day at school? I probably said it was fine, because I didn't want to admit that actually I'd been beaten. So I set out to take charge of the situation and manage my race performance, something I have continued to do to this day. Slowly, some of the white children began to accept me. This included the abuser. I remember they used to say to me, I was okay as a Paki. Later, Paki became a subject that I began to study. There was a book by Mungham and Pearson that I came across when I was a sociology student in 1978, and it had a chapter in it, Paki bashing in a northern town. Well worth a read, but when you read it at your own peril. Last year, I wrote about the topic in a biography of the word Paki. I have recently updated it. It now includes the experiences of Joe and the chair. The particular one that Joe wrote, she informed me that she was reading it, and I said, oh, would you like to? And she said she'd suffered abuse a long time ago and recently. And I said, oh, can you write me a couple of sentences? And she wrote me a page and a half. And I got to the second paragraph when I was reading one afternoon about a week ago, and I burst into tears. My wife, who also works at home with me, I went over to her and said, give me a hug. These things are personal, and they're not dispassionate kind of subjects. I continued my journey as an immigrant. Who are you? Where do you come from? No, where do you really come from? These are the kind of questions we get asked all the time. Saman Shad has written about this from her Australian experience, which appears similar to our situation here. Each encounter we have requires us to perform race and to manage ourselves, and each encounter helps us to become a little more conscious of ourselves as we try to obtain a balance between the inside and the outside. As for me, thanks in part to the questions from others, it was clear in my mind a long time ago who I was. I was a Pakistani, I was an Asian, sometimes I was black, because in the 70s we used black as a political term. But above all, I was British. This was my home, with all its rights and responsibilities, but I wasn't going anywhere, and I wanted the best of what was owed to me. And of course, I was going to play my part in it. Now, another more recent incident in the post-9/11 world, post-7/7 world. It reminded me that our identity is not just how we define it, but also how others see us. Especially so in what Anderson and Sean have defined it as the white space. I was walking my dog in our local park. We'd recently moved to this mainly white area. So for the locals, I was strange. Being a Saturday morning, I was off duty, probably half asleep, kind of awake enough to be walking. And, my kind of mind was kind of blank. My guard was definitely down. I was not performing race, or indeed anything else for that matter. I was just being, just living. I met a white man with his dog. We stopped to have a chat because I always like to talk to people and listen to their stories. The man saw in front of him a different me to the one I know. He didn't see in front of him any of my multiple identities. My work, paid and unpaid, what I do in the community, my family roles, my age, my writing, my taste in music, my taste in literature, and certainly my taste in music, especially Bruce Springsteen, whose T-shirt I was wearing on that day. So imagine a black T-shirt with Bruce Springsteen emblazoned on it with his glasses. I don't know whether I had my glasses on. White shorts. I was, not threatening anyone. What did he see? He saw beyond all of that, beyond all of me. He noticed my colored skin, and he saw a brown man. And what's going on in his head? The brown men are dangerous. We got talking, and he said to me, this wasn't a question, he made a statement. And he said it with a smile. He said, you're not a bomber, you are properly integrated. And I thought, pardon? This man is thinking terrorists. And he thinks I'm not one of those. So in his head, terrorists are brown, I'm a brown man, therefore, he needs to reassure himself. Okay. A comment on the rules of engagement. One of the things I learned quite a long time ago when I was running a course called Asian Studies, we had a talk on racism, and Ranjit Sondhi, one of the Birmingham activists, gave a talk, and it upset some of the people who were listening, and they wrote to me complaining. and I learned that actually if a black man or an Asian man talks about racism, white people find it more threatening. And I thought we'd changed and moved on. In some ways we have, but in other ways we haven't. You will remember the incident Professor Andrews was a part of on Good Morning Britain. He didn't say anything new in that program. He has on many other occasions, but in that program, he said Churchill was racist. And even I knew, and I'm not an academic, even I knew that. And I'd read books. Richard Toye had written a book. John Harry had written an article. Bogdanor had written a book where Churchill thought "Keep England White" was a good election slogan. The critical thing that was upsetting Piers Morgan was the black color. And I dug into it and found Remy Joseph Salisbury had had a similar experience some time before. And he's analyzed it and written about it. It's worth having a read. He's published it last month in the Sociological Review, and it's listed in the references. Our society welcomes immigrants, but there are conditions attached. It requires of us to be the right kind of immigrant. We have to dutifully and gratefully play the role assigned to us. And when we assert our presence in any other way, that is not welcome. It is met with hostility. A couple of concluding comments. Firstly, that performing race is hard work. Ahmed, who happens to be the brother of Riz Ahmed, Kamran Ahmed, has written about mental health hazards of being a person of color. Shad has written an article on how it's exhausting being a minority. Torino described microaggressions as death by 1,000 cuts. I look forward to a day when we can just be, without having to perform race. This desire was best articulated for me by Patricia Williams in her 1997 Wreath Lectures. The color of one's skin is part of ourselves. It does not matter. It is precious, and yet it should not matter. It is important, and yet it must not matter. It is simultaneously our greatest vanity and anxiety, and I am of the opinion, like Martin Luther King, that none of this should matter. Secondly, that performing race is generally assumed to be done by black people, Asian people, and other visible minorities. White people generally don't bother with it. They think race, ethnicity, identity are not about them. But the situation is changing. The wider context is changing. This requires white people to develop a kind of multiracial literacy, to be inclusive, to be non-racist, with an awareness of self and others in our multicultural world. And also a willingness by those white people to share the white privilege and the white spaces that I referred to earlier. I, for one, would find that very helpful, because the amount of time I spend with white people, I would like to have more conversations about these things with them. But I find that they don't have the vocabulary and the understanding. So by the time I've explained what I mean, I'm too tired to talk about what it is I wanted to talk about. There are signs, hopeful signs. I know in the academic world there is focus on whiteness. I'm part of a group in Birmingham with some of the local people in the Christian community where we're talking around a book called White Fragility. And we had a meeting in September, and we've got a meeting coming up next week, where a couple of us black people are part of a white group who are in a learning mode. So that encourages me. We could go on about this issue. But we're not going to, because you have somewhere to go, and I have somewhere to go, and I know the chair has. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, so I wanted to ask the panel then, no specific person, how can white people become effective allies without erasing you from your own narrative or profiting from my trauma?
I would suggest that, that you start to read and talk to people. So it's people who think of themselves as educated. The thing I was talking about, multicultural literacy, people, I find, and I'm generalizing now, people don't have that multicultural literacy. So there is a lot of stuff that's been written. When somebody like me writes a biography of the word Paki, you're writing about yourself, but you step out of that and you tell yourself that this is not about beating people up and killing them and so on, who are from your community, and you write your emotions, you pour your heart out. They're things that are there to be read and understood. So there is quite a lot that is, and there are some excellent books out. Read, talk to people.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a sense, that twin, I mean, it's not even a difficulty, it's a twin reality, is something that I don't think can be gotten out of. I mean, I think, you know, from my point of view, as somebody who does live that whiteness and is trying to live it in a way that understands my own relationship to racisms and all sorts of intersecting dynamics of power, I don't think those are things that are get-outable of, but I think they're things that we need to be responsible for in the present. I think the difficulties and the thing that I wasn't really able to talk about, and then I'll wrap it, the thing that I wasn't really able to talk about is the way that there's multiple things going on at the same time within any given kind of lived situation. And one of the ways in which whiteness as a relation of domination lives itself out is by defining all of that in a particular way from itself as though it is a centre, if that makes sense. So I suppose that's partly why I kind of tried to strip out a lot of the theory, kind of from my point, and I do that badly. But I think there's loads of stuff in there, but I don't think they're things we can get out of, and I think they're things that we need to be able to recognise and talk about and talk respectfully to one another. So like the not profiting thing, in a sense, is sometimes about like asking somebody what you can and can't say in the context of whatever's going on. I mean, in these sorts of events, you have to take responsibility for what you do. If that makes, so I don't know whether that's anyway, but yeah.
I think I probably will just agree in part with what both speakers have said so far. So I think that change can happen through collaboration, but I think that change will only happen because of the way that power operates. I mean, I try to be hopeful and that change will occur, that there will be a more level playing field. But I think that for me, that movements like the decolonisation of the curriculum, decolonisation of institutions, but done through collaboration, I feel is really important. I think that taking up our space and standing, which is why in my title the word arise was really important. I think we have to stand, we have to take our space, but then I think there's room for collaboration and change can come that way. But it's absolutely trying to dismantle these historical structures of power, and I don't know, I hope it's possible.
Do I have to say something? I don't necessarily want to really direct a question except to say we're in a very dark time at the moment, and wherever there's power, there's resistance. Wherever there's power, there's resistance.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I've noticed there's lipstick all over this. It's not me.
Hi, my name's Jenny Alboyne. I'm a fine artist. I'm from UAL. Thank you very much for your speeches, and I'm just wondering what you think about resilience. I want to know if you think that it's something that can be taught, or if it's something that is generated through experience and just being able to deal with things. A lot of the stories and experiences that were said on the stage I can sort of remember, but because of, I suppose, not being serious, I used to do, I will declare that I used to tell my white friend that I needed chocolate to stay black, and she used to give me chocolate every day. And I don't regret her. And I know it's not serious, but I had to have strategies to deal with stuff in Croydon with the skinheads, and it worked for me. So it's just about resilience. Sorry, I went off there.
Can I take a second question, and we can go around and answer both of them?
Thank you. My name is Dr. Opie Laurie, and I'm the Director of Pre-Imaging and Action. Okay, so this question is actually to you, Professor Andrews. Thank you very much, everyone actually, and I think maybe all of you could add to this. I think you're right about the fact that we had to think about the psychosis of racial formations. And I think until we do that, like you said, we'll just be colluding in reinforcing whiteness. So I would like to hear your views on the use of people of colour, or academics of colour. Students of colour. Okay, another one. Alumni of colour, right? So for me, it feels like these are just reinforcing what whiteness is. And someone who said it really nicely was Dr. Les Henry, who's a black critical thinker. And he says, this is the way that whiteness parades as the ever-present non-presence that molds and shapes reality. And I think until we start looking at that, we will keep on doing this thing. You know, this is a very prescriptive behaviour. So what are your views on that particular term?
Thank you very much indeed. I'll start with you then, and then if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think, would you define yourself as a non-white? I mean, nobody would say non-white, but this is what you say when you say of color, right? And it makes sense in many ways because everybody's a victim of racism. When I give you that statistic about a child dies every 10 seconds because they have no food, you know, that's black children, brown children, that is children of color. But one of the things we have to understand about how racism operates is white supremacy is a hierarchy. Embedded in white supremacy is anti-blackness. And what you have seen historically, currently, presently, is that groups are slightly up the hierarchy but still oppressed will use anti-blackness in order to benefit themselves, right? China would be the best example of this. Yeah. So the idea you can lump white people and non-white people together is for me, it's just a bad strategy, right? You have to, this is one of us where I talk about blackity black all the time, and talk about black independence, you just need that, because just because somebody's not black, or not white, sorry, doesn't mean they're your friend. Just because someone's black, it doesn't mean they're your friend, by the way. So I think it's really important that we have far more nuance in this debate, but sometimes there are many areas where it makes sense to come together as people who are victims of racism. I think you do that because you're victims of racism, you don't do that because you're not white. I think that's the difference. On that issue of resilience, I mean, look, it's a struggle. It's called the struggle for a reason. Like, it's supposed to be difficult. And I think we try to kind of protect ourselves from that struggle, but that struggle is what makes us who we are. When I told my mum about microaggressions, the idea of paper cuts of racism, she looked at me, she said, that's what being black is, cut her eye and walked away. And I think sometimes we need to kind of embrace the struggle is important because it builds a certain resilience, I think.
I keep remembering Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask because He's one of the few writers to unpack the psychological of race, and it's worth returning to the psychology of race. And it does conjoin with resilience. I think trauma as process, not trauma as event, like the Holocaust. I'm talking about a constant process. We have survived. But what is the price we've paid in terms of our bodies and what lives through our bodies? And where do we tell our stories? And in healing is to tell our stories. And that deals with pain. And that is a form of healing. And it's also investing in our minds, because there are many issues around mental health. And investing not simply in the church, but in spirituality, which is a lot more deeper, and investing in counseling, making that real investment, paying that money to have counseling, and with counselors, because many of us we do, and I know of my generation, born here, of Caribbean parents, and what our parents had to do to make us survive, we were kind of othered, and we have not unpacked that, and we're passing those issues on to the next generation. So we are strong, but what is the price we've paid for that?
I'm not sure there's more I can add to that, really. I always go back to Fanon's idea of the colonization of minds, and the fact that it's my mind and it's the mind of the colonizer as well that is colonized and distorted. And as we've already heard, the psychosis is in all of us. But I think that I would almost describe myself as accidentally resilient. And I want to come back to your talk, where you're going about your business and you're just you. And then someone will remind you that you're not quite human, or you're not quite the norm. And, you know, my whole journey, and I've talked about this before, you know, I work in fashion, but my whole journey into unpacking who I am and reading Fanon and embracing bell hooks and all of those other people came because I was completely invisible. At the height of my fashion career, I was head of design for Laura Ashley. I would go for meetings at Vogue House or wherever, and it was a meeting with the head of design at Laura Ashley. I'd turn up at reception, and it was almost like they were looking for Christine, and I would be going, it's actually me. It's me. And then a colleague from our Boston office said, it's so great that you're head of design, because let's face it, you're not exactly an English rose. But that person did me a favor, because then I started to unpack the fact that actually I'm quite resilient to have got there, but then what's the cost, and what can I do now for people coming up behind me, and what can I do to understand my identity, to understand my race, to understand that I do have a history and I do have culture and I am human as well.
Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of things I was thinking. The first one was around how we actually think about education. And so for me, the ways that we think about educating as a rational kind of form of activity, which is about teaching. So, I mean, this is the thing about the whiteness stuff that I didn't really get to go through. A lot of that work, like, there is an embedded kind of way of thinking about whiteness that it's something that we can, like, unlearn, we can rationalize out. And I think that is actually about how we understand kind of being human and how that's defined through all sorts of ways of thinking about the human, which are actually about the construction of material capitalism, which is why, for me, something like the Birmingham Centre for Cultural Studies work was so important, because it brings that into a present. So it brings those colonial formations that we've been talking about in that long durée into the present. So there's that. But then I'm also thinking about another work that, again, if I'd have kept more of the theory in and less of the Sir Shedry Crooks's work on desiring whiteness, and that whiteness actually comes to be through a desire to control what it is to be human. So this idea that we all exercise, you know, this aspirational quality that it has, and that certainly if you think about psychosis as a form of repetition from a psychodynamic point of view, which is partly what, then for sure, that works as a definition of whiteness, but it also works as a definition of actually thinking about how the racial visual schema comes to be and how it constitutes us all as human or not human.
Yes, adversity is a precondition for resilience, and people of color have faced plenty of adversity. The trouble is our communities and our children at times don't have the understanding of our histories. So Black history, Asian history, and so on should be given space in the curriculum, but not just 1 month a year. Because we need to understand where we're coming from, the struggles that have gone on in our communities, slavery, colonialism, British rule, the 50s and 60s before equality legislation, when it was okay to put up notices excluding people. Our children who are growing up here, second, third generation, need to be taught that. And I would say quite a lot of white children would also appreciate and would give them the foundations for the whiteness, because the world is changing. Many of our communities are becoming places where whites are going to be minorities, like Birmingham, Luton, Slough, and so on. So we better change, all of us together.
There's a question there.
Hi, is this working?
It ought to.
Yeah? Oh, thank you. So I'm a bachelor student here. I'm doing my dissertation on the representation of Black artists in the media in the past from 1950s till now, and I'm making a comparison between social media and all of that television. My question is actually what has changed? So the representation of Black artists in the media, and if anything changed, why?
Anybody want to answer that?
One needs clarification of what you mean, the representation of Black artists in the media, because there has been change and there has not been change, and I would entirely agree. Many of us won awards. You turn on the TV and the black face is there. I think those kind of representations have changed, and some of them are a bit more constructive. There still are stereotypes, I won't doubt that, but things have shifted. The other important part, where are those black artists from the 1950s? Where are they in the archive? They are in the archive, they do exist. I could name a few places, but as a student in terms of forming your dissertation, it's maybe going beyond this college, and if it isn't here, demanding that the librarian gets that material in, going outside of here, going to other archives, such as the Stuart Hall Library, such as the National Theatre has an archive there, a black theatre. These material does exist, but the problem is it's hidden. It's either hidden or ignored or erased in terms of the national curriculum. And I mean, I teach at London College of Fashion. You know, it's the same issue. A dominant white supremacist curriculum, Eurocentric, over and over, repeated over and over again. In fact, there is resistance to being inclusive. I'm not saying it's like it should. There is actually conscious resistance to it. There is initiatives at Chelsea College of Art, and I would think here and other kind of drama schools, there have been initiatives. There have been initiatives. Where is the record? Where are they in the archives? You have to search for that, and also with yourself of like minds, go and look for that. It is there.
Okay, I want to back up what Michael's saying. I think the issue is that the archives are there, but things just stay in the archives. And it takes someone that has a specific interest to bring them out of the archives. So there's a lot of invisibility. And then as you were sort of speaking, one thing that strikes me, and I think it's a Caribbean scholar, Michael Buckner, I think it is, that coined the phrase exclusion by inclusion. And I think that that's what's happening now with the arts in general, the way that artists are included in inverted commas in the media. So there are particular artists and then the box is ticked, if you like. And if you sit outside that particular remit, you're invisible again. But everybody around you is ticking the box and saying, yes, we are being inclusive. So I think this situation of exclusion by inclusion is really what's happening. I think the other thing that I find in the visual arts, often where black artists are included, it's actually African-American artists or African artists versus African. You're a fine arts student, I think you said. So often the push is visibility of African artists, not homegrown African diaspora visual artists, and yet the box is ticked. So that's what I mean by exclusion by inclusion. So the media can sort of pat themselves on the back and say, yes, we are representing black art, but actually it's a one-dimensional notion of black art and black artists' work.
Nazir, can I say something? Can I just, while we're waiting, say something about the issue of representation? And I want to actually come back to something that you were just saying there before about kind of learning. And for me, a lot of this is about the destabilizing. This invisibility thing is about not being allowed to ask questions about definition, I think. So what is it to represent? So for me, a white way of representing is to objectify. It is to describe. It is to allow something to be included, to describe it, to form it, to whatever. That kind of fundamental process of objectification is needs to be unpacked in the first place, if that makes sense. And that's why the questions like, I'm kind of hopeful, but I'm kind of not, because it depends on how we teach history. Even like adding in bits of history from whatever perspectives, it's about questioning for me, like how this stuff's constituted.
My question is, how do you... being told to, so I'm going to take my space. How do you stay true to yourself and share your truth with people when there's like roadblocks at every single corner and you have to over-explain? I struggled a lot with academic writing because I'm proud, and I felt like, why am I over-explaining myself if I know that when you read what I'm writing, you're not going to understand it anyway? You know, I had to kind of resolve to writing for people who have done the reading, who have the mindset, because in a certain institution, it's going to be like, oh, well, you know, well, that was nice. You know, you had, but for me, it's a real opportunity to explore and to find out about myself. But how am I still able to maintain that sense of truth and validity in a space that doesn't want to hear it?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fantastic that you stood your ground there, and this idea of black people standing is really important to me. And there are certain things that I always go back to, and there's a wonderful essay by Lubaina Himid, and it's entitled "We Are Not, We're Us, We're Not Other," and it's this whole idea of not operating from a place of lack. Often I don't explain myself. Often in my academic writing, I will write in patois. I don't care. It's part of the way I speak normally. And so for me, it's a quiet political act to write in my language that comes in and out of standard English, goes into Jamaican patois. I don't care. And often I speak at other events, and similarly, I speak in the way that I would speak, or I dip in and out of different languages, different identities, and I just expect people to catch up, because that's what we all have to do. And I think it's Stuart Hall, the great man, that said, you know, if you are in a minority, you have to know how you operate, but you have to also know how the rest of the world operates. They don't need to know about you. And so I try to behave as though I don't have any lack, I don't explain, and I quietly stand my ground.
One last question.
I mean, the thing is, who you're writing for. That's the key thing. And even when I write academic stuff, it's for black people. Like, I'll just be honest, like, be really honest. And that means that obviously you can't get to where I am professionally without kind of having that white approval and doing that stuff that white people like. But really, when you think about who your audience is, what the point is, what the purpose is, and you have to write for that audience, and that means you're not going to have exactly the career you want. That's a trade-off. But you kind of have to do both. But really, the main thing is who are you writing for, I guess.
I was just interested to the idea of decolonizing the curriculum. It's increasingly difficult when it should be decreasingly for as an early career researcher, myself as an actor and a practitioner, to pursue higher education, and i.e. a postgraduate degree, with ideas about unpicking underrepresentation and race, when you're either always referred to one academic that seems to cover most of London, or the academics that you do meet then say, oh yes, this would be really good, we should put you with this particular person who went to Cambridge and they understand marginalisation. And you think, do they? Really? And again, it goes back to the issue of resilience, but trying to get to that level and to be mentored or supervised by people that really do understand where you're coming from and your aspirations and what you want to do, and not to unpick it in the way that they want you to present that information, which goes back to looking at the curriculum through whiteness theory, and that's already started. And so how do you sort of combat that? That's a long question, sorry.
Yeah, very briefly, I think it's very difficult. University is university, but there are different spaces in universities. Part of why I said the career that you want, look, I could never have had the career I currently have at Oxford. Forget that, they don't want that black stuff, forget it, right? But there are other spaces. We have a space at Birmingham City University in Black Studies, which is different, right? But that does mean that certain doors don't get open to you. And at some point, you have to say, what's more important? Do I want to do this work and there are places to do it? Or if I'm going to these other spaces, I'm going to have to change it a little bit. And that's just, unfortunately, the reality. But that's the reality we've got to live with. It's called the struggle for a reason. And I'll pass it.
People of color are highly educated, period. We just don't get the jobs. We're highly educated. One of the things is to understand what university is. It is the center of the civilization. Once you understand that, then you want the struggle that we have of challenge and knowledge which is encrusted and embedded. And you're not alone, my dear. You are not alone, and don't be alone. And seek alliances and collaboration with other progressive people who want to decolonize and change that, right? But also recognize, as I think Christine was saying, the power that you are struggling against, and to sustain that, how to sustain that. And I think, right, speak in your own voice, because the only thing that we have is our integrity. That's all we have, is our integrity, being true to ourselves.
Yes, I kind of agree with Michael, and I was just scribbling down. I love my Caribbean scholars. And another great man, John LaRose, said, sense make before book. So as Michael says, you know, we are well educated, we do have the knowledge. We're not necessarily in those positions of power, but I think it's about seeking out those people, seeking out other network, go towards the light. There are universities that they're just going to shut the door on you, but there are other places, as you're saying, that will welcome you with open arms. And you go to those spaces, you know, for many years, I sat myself down in the Stuart Hall Library and I had my little group there because they welcomed me. I couldn't get an academic job for love nor money. You know, I finished my PhD in 2009. But I thought, no, I'm doing this work for a reason. I'm doing this work for those people in those images I showed and for people coming up behind me. I'm not doing it for me. And so I just go to the spaces that I can spread myself out in, I can stand my ground, do my thing, and hope that people find me and I can help and mentor people coming up behind.
Yeah, I suppose kind of speaking from a personal point of view, I've got a similar take maybe than aspects of what's been said already. Having left, made a really active decision to leave the Russell Group because of how I found myself, my work, my collaborations being framed and constrained was a very, very active decision for me. It was a kind of collapse before that, but it was an active decision that I thought through very carefully. And that is partly about, I still don't know how I feel about being in a university, but maybe I won't ever. And, you know, whatever. But I think for me, yeah, in the end you have to make choices. And I wanted to say to the other person who stood up, Amy Breeze Harper has just, I found her stuff recently. She does kind of food activism and has really been talking interestingly about kind of her relationship to the academy. She moved out of the academy and had gone through a very kind of trajectory through to Berkeley. Anyway, she's an interesting person to kind of engage with, I've learned. For the black woman who's resisted and left the academy and just said, I've had enough, but does really great work. So.
Really a last word from me. There is overt racism that is brutal, and there are many places where that is a problem, and it continues to be a problem, and I don't want to undermine that. But the real vicious racism for me is that which comes with a smile. It is polite, it is liberal, and it is all around us, wherever we are, in the systems and the structures. So the colonial form of government continues, and that is what needs dismantling.
Can I, on your behalf, can I thank our panel? Please just show your appreciation in the usual way.